Dear ladies and gentlemen, пані та панове, I'm delighted to open episode number 42 of our series of conversations and interviews with intellectuals in Ukraine and abroad. For those out there who are keen to learn more, think deeper, and hear from the original sources. Рада відкрити 42-й епізод нашої серії бесід та інтерв'ю з інтелектуалами в Україні та за кордоном для тих, хто прагне дізнатися більше, думати глибше та чути з перших джерел. Earlier this week on Tuesday, we launched Pan International Case List, Impunity Reigns, Writers Resist, which documents 115 cases of writers facing harassment, arrest, violence, and even death worldwide. One of those emblematic cases, those days, of whose day of memory we marked yesterday, Pan Ukraine organized an incredible event in his native Kapitolivka near Kharkiv, was Volodymyr Vakulenko, award-winning children's writer. A year ago, around 11 a.m. on 24th of March, a bus with a Z sign drove up to Vakulenko's house and took him towards Izium. His relatives never saw him again. However, subsequently he decided to bury his war diary under a cherry tree in his garden. This diary was just exhibited in the Kharkiv Museum. I would ask you to start our episode today from the minute of silence for our dear friend, children's writer Volodymyr. Дякую. Для наших українських слухачів учора ми відзначали День пам'яті. Український ПЕН організував неймовірну подію в рідній Капітолівці під Харковом для Володимира Вакуленка, лауреата премії для дітей дитячого письменника, який був викрадений рік тому, 24 березня, близько 11 ранку. До його дому під'їхав автобус із знаком Z і повіз його в бік Ізюма. Більше рідні його не бачили. Володя сховав свій щоденник під вишнею у саду. Цей щоденник останніми днями можна було побачити у Харківському музеї. Дякую вам за цю хвилину мовчання. Більше про Володимира та інші випадки, як от справу захопленого і засудженого до 13 років ув'язнення українського журналіста і правозахисника Максима Буткевича у нашому кейс-листі, який був випущений у цей вівторок та документує 115 випадків переслідувань, арештів, насильства та смерті письменників у всьому світі. One of those who stand at the front line of freedom of expression fight is PEN Ukraine, the main organizer of this project. It is co-hosted by PEN International, which has continued to provide a platform for freedom of expression for those currently under the highest risk. And I want to thank to our supporters, the US Embassy in Ukraine, PEN America, the Ukrainian Institute, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, Local History, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and the Harman Institute at Columbia University. We stream today's event to all partners' Facebook pages. Серед тих, хто не покладає рук у боротьбі за свободу слова, головний організатор діалогів – Український центр ПЕН. Співорганізатором проєкту є Міжнародний ПЕН, який продовжує надавати платформу для свободи вираження поглядів тим, хто перебуває у групі найвищого ризику. Проєкт втілюється за підтримки Посольства США в Україні, ПЕН Америка, Український інститут Лондона, Україна Світ, Локальна історія, Український науково-дослідний інститут Гарвардського університету та інститут Гаррівана при Колумбійському університеті. Ми транслюємо сьогоднішню подію на всі партнерські. Захід відбуватиметься англійською мовою. My name is Olha Mukha and I work for PEN International, honored to be part of PEN Ukraine. And today I'm delighted to introduce our very special guest. And Applebaum is one of those who wrote about Ukraine a long time before it became trendy. Her books, Iron Curtain, Gulag History, and Red Famine had all appeared in more than 24 translations, including all major European languages. She's also a Pulitzer Award-winning historian, a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the Agora Institute, where she co-directed a run-up program on disinformation and 21st century propaganda. A lot to be discussed on this issue. In your recent conversation with Bill Crystal, you just mentioned that Russian propaganda is designed for people to be apathetic and have no opinion. And on the other hand, that Ukrainians surpassed all the possible expectations. We are looking forward for more insights from you today, and thank you so much for joining us. And Anne will hold her conversation with Oleksandra Matviichuk, absolutely unstoppable Ukrainian human rights lawyer and civil society leader, who brought Ukrainians the very first in our history Nobel Prize. She had the non-profit organization Center for Civil Liberties and is an active campaigner for democratic reforms. The Center of Civil Liberties was awarded in the 2022 Nobel Prize for Peace, jointly with Alice Bilatsky from Belarus and Russian organization Memorial. This high award is quite a logical development in the previous list of Alexandra's achievements. That's a huge pleasure to have you here with us today. I will pass the stage to you and disappear from the screen for about 40 minutes to come back with our audience's questions. Please leave them in the comments. Have a great talk and let's find new ways. Thank you. And the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here. Olha, thank you for that excellent introduction. I'm particularly flattered to be here with Oleksandra, who I think I've now heard speak 4 or 5 times at different public events in Taiwan, in Washington, in Ukraine, and impresses me more every single time. So thank you for letting me appear with her. And I'm going to start our conversation. I think the idea is that I'll ask some questions, she'll respond, maybe she'll have questions for me later on. But I want to start with something I remember her saying to me a couple of months ago. Oleksandra, we were talking about the interest in human rights questions that's now being shown by people outside of Ukraine, interest in war crimes, human rights violations, in the course of the war. And you said to me that it's a pity that it took this war for people to become interested, that it was hard to get people to focus on what was going on in the Donbass, in Donetsk and Luhansk. In the run-up to the war, it was hard to get people to focus even on what the Russians were doing in Syria. But that's now changed. Can you talk about that? Can you tell me what your impression is of the human rights community, its attitude towards Ukraine, and the conversation about human rights in Ukraine, how it's changed over the last year or so?
I will start with the point that it's a huge honor for me to take part in the conversation with Applebaum, whom I respect and admire very much. And thank you, PAN of Ukraine, to organize this possibility and this excellent event. I am a human rights lawyer who have been applying the law for many years to defend people and human dignity. And now I and other Ukrainian human rights colleagues are doing our work in the circumstances when the law doesn't work at all. And this is a new reality, which is a result not just of the strengthening of authoritarian regimes, I mean Russia and other regimes in the different parts of the world, but some very dangerous development in the well-developed societies and well-developed democracies as well. What do I mean? I mean that the problem is not only in this, that authoritarian regime built more and more strong centralized vertical and suppress the space of freedom in their countries to the size of the prison cell. The problem is that even in well-developed democracies, the political forces gain weight, who become openly putting into the doubt the universal principle of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think it's because that after the Second World War, the generation who know the price for freedom, for rule of law, and for democracy who fight for these values, who fight for the chance to build such system after the Second World War, they are gone. And now current generations are more consumers of the democracy, of rule of law, of human rights than producers of these values. And that is why, because they are not fighting for these values, they don't understand the real meaning of the things. And we can observe how for years, even in well-developed democracies, a huge part of population extend to exchange these values for other things, for economical benefits, for illusion of safety, or for their own comfort. And now, when we speak about Russian war against Ukraine, we speak not just about the war between two states, but the war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. And Ukraine provides great examples to the whole world how people very bravely fight for their freedom and for democratic choice. And this, I hope, provoke the rethinking of these values inside the societies of well-developed democracies itself.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the war has had that impact already? I mean, do you detect in your interlocutors and in the people that you speak to in Western Europe and the United States, rather, do you detect a beginning of a new understanding?
It's a question of some sociological survey, which I have no access for, and I really don't know whether or not some sociological agencies provide such research. But from the non-formal conversation, not with just human rights defenders in different countries, which always was on the same side with us, but with conversation with diplomats, with politicians, with members of governments, with experts of the leading analytical think tanks, I hope that I witness this this attempt to rethink the importance of human rights as the value, because for decades, the voice of human rights defenders wasn't heard. And governments, even in well-developed democracies, they based their political decision on economical benefits or security issue, especially when we speak about external policy. And Russia is a bright example, because Russia for decades persecute their own Russian civil society and jailed journalists, killed activists, dispersed peaceful demonstrations. But governments of well-developed democracies closed their eyes and they continued shake Putin's hand, build gas pipeline, make business as usual with Russia. And now they start to understood that in short-term result, maybe they benefit, but in long term, we all failed, because we have to base our political decision not just on economical interest or geopolitical factors, but on value of human rights and rule of law as well.
One of the things that's happened over the last 10 years, maybe even 20 years, is that a lot of the international institutions that are formally supposed to deal with human rights, and I mean particularly the United Nations institutions, were deliberately attacked and degraded and undermined by autocracies. So whether it was China or Russia or actually Saudi Arabia or North Korea, all of them sought to have places on the UN Human Rights Commission. All of them sought to become kind of counterbalancing voices inside these kinds of institutions. They tried to shape the language that they used. The Chinese were particularly good at this, changing the nature of the language so that it would mean something slightly different. The Chinese like to speak a lot, for example, about the word sovereignty. We need to respect sovereignty in international relations. And by sovereignty, they meant our right to do what we want inside our borders, including attacking our own minorities or our own people. I noticed that they didn't talk so much about sovereignty since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it had this very specific meaning for them, and a number of other countries took up that as well. Do you think that these institutions, especially in the UN, but elsewhere, can be rescued? Or do we need something different? Do we need a different, kind of organization? Do we need to refound these institutions, recreate them? Have you thought at all about that? Because it's something I've tried to think about, and the best ideas I can come up with involve creating more ad hoc institutions. In other words, institutions that deal with a particular issue at a particular time, rather than these long-standing, based in Geneva or New York, organizations that are somehow easily undermined by their members. Have you thought about that at all?
Yes, I do, because when I speak about situation when human rights defenders are doing our job in circumstances when the law doesn't work, I speak about the fundamental question: how we people in 21st century will defend people and their human dignity. Can we rely upon legal instruments? I mean, international law and the whole infrastructure of different international organizations who was deliberately created to defend this international law and to force the norms into practice, or we can't rely upon the rule of law and only brutal force matters. And this is not abstract question, because when we look to the example of Russian war against Ukraine, we can see that the entire international system of peace and security couldn't stop Russian atrocities. And Putin tried to convince the whole world that democracy, rule of law, and human rights are fake values because they couldn't protect you during the war. He tried to demonstrate that state with a strong military potential and nuclear power can have a right to dictate their rules to the whole world and even forcibly change the internationally recognized state borders. And we have to respond something to this claim. It's not just Ukrainians' problem. It's a problem for the whole world because it's connected with this question which I just raised: how we can protect people in 21st century. And if we will not be able to restore international order, it can result in a very dangerous development of the whole world, where government decided that we have to invest money not in healthcare, education, development, solving complex problems like climate change or social inequality, but instead of this, they will invest money into the weapons, because if we can't rely upon an international system, we have to rely upon at least something. And that is why I do believe that we have to start a cardinal reform of international system of peace and security. This system was built after the Second World War by victorious states, and they provided the irrational preferences to some states. And this system is not work anymore. The bright example, when Secretary General of UN came to Kiev to meet President Zelensky, at the same day, the Russian rocket hit residential buildings in Kiev and killed in her own flat our colleagues, journalist Vera Beric. So this is our general responsibility to build a system to restart this existing mechanisms in order to be able effectively protect people against authoritarian regimes and wars, in order to protect and to provide us as the people human rights defense and security guarantees, regardless whether or not we live in a country with a strong military potential or nuclear power.
let me ask you about one institution that has recently made a step in the right direction. I have to say I was surprised by it. And this is the International Criminal Court, which issued this indictment of President Putin. I was surprised because usually heads of state are considered somehow exceptional because it's assumed that, you know, we'll need to eventually talk to this head of state, you know, to end the war or to have a dialogue. You know, it's very, very rare for, you know, for an international institution like the International Criminal Court, which, although doesn't represent every country in the world, it represents a very large number. It's more than 100, I think. So it was really a big step. It was something that was very different. And I'm wondering if you could talk about, first of all, why you think that happened. What was the thinking inside the court? You know, you must have been following it. And second of all, maybe more importantly, what impact it will have. You know, obviously the Russians have already said, you know, we ignore it, we don't believe it, we're not interested in this. You know, Xi Jinping came to Moscow just, you know, a couple of days after the court issued its statement, you know, showing in effect that the leader of China doesn't care about these statements. I think that was maybe even one of the purposes of the visit. At the same time, we've had very senior leaders in Germany, in the United States, say that they expect that Putin could be arrested if he were to enter a country that was a member of the ICC, and that includes Germany. It doesn't include the United States, but it does include Germany and I think most European countries. So, you know, as I said, first of all, the thinking behind it, and also what, you know, how will this shape the conversation going forward?
I think that it's historical decision. It's not only because the Putin become a wanted man in 123 countries who ratify Rome Statute, if I'm not mistaken, but because it's first in the history, International Criminal Court issued arrest warrant against current head of the state, which are member of Security Council of UN, and which have a strong nuclear potential. And if we return to my previous point that this is a civilizational battle between authoritarianism and democracy, ICC plays on the side of democracy and demonstrate that rule of law is more important than your military potential. And regardless who you are, if you committed the severe international crimes under its jurisdiction of the court will prosecute you because justice has to prevail brutal force. And this is a strong signal. And I welcomed this decision. It will have impact in short-term and long-term horizon. In long term, the destiny of Putin become more and more clear. We know from the history that authoritarian regimes collapse and their leaders who seem themselves untouchable appeared under the court. And even when countries don't want to cooperate with international justice, they had to if they want not to be isolated. And Serbia with Milosevic and Karadzic is a bright example. But in short term, it's also have results because we still have countries which are far from of the context or context of what's going on, or have a very close economical or other ties with Russia. And even in countries which support Ukraine, there are still politicians who want to return to business as usual with Putin because of their political goals or some economical benefits or other reasons. And now all of them have to take into account that Putin is officially suspected war criminal, and they have to deal with this fact. And okay, China is a leader of authoritarianism spectrum, if I may say like this, but countries who pretend to work differently and to build their external policy on the on the value of rule of law, they can't afford themselves such behavior.
Yes, one of the thoughts I had was that, you know, although some people, of course, will dismiss this as being not very important, I can imagine, you know, down the line, if we come to a moment when Russian political power begins to change, I can imagine this actually being very convenient for some future Russian government if they need something to do with Putin. You know, what are the options? We can send him to Dubai, you know, we can send him to Beijing, or maybe we can just send him to The Hague. So, you know, I actually thought it could, you know, I mean, this can play both ways because, of course, it also gives Putin extra incentive not to lose power because he can.
Sure.
You know, and so, you know, you can argue, and I have heard some people argue that this is, you know, maybe a mistake because it will, you know, reinforce him in his desire to stay in power. But you can also see how it might make something, you know, easier for people down the road, which is of course what happened with Serbia. You know, the Serbians needed something to do with, you know, Mr. Karadzic, and fortunately The Hague was there to offer them this possibility. So so that's very good. And of course, I wouldn't also underestimate the fact that the nature of the particular case, you know, the deportation of children, and the naming of the woman who's the head of this children's policy inside Russia, I thought was also very important because it's a case that's very clear. You know, it's something the Russians have admitted to. You know, they're not denying that they've done this. They're not hiding the fact that there are Ukrainian children in Russia. You know, they've appeared on television. And so it's not and it's also a case where there's really no ambiguity. There's no problem. There's no question of witnesses. There's no question of testimony being questioned. You know, the children have been seen on Russian television. And so I thought that was also quite clever. I mean, I don't know, would you expect them to add other cases, or is this do you think this sets a sufficient precedent?
It's very clear why International Criminal Court start with this case. They before told that children's rights is priorities for International Criminal Court, but in official press release, prosecutor of International Criminal Court said that there will be other cases as well. And we can just predict what they can choose, because we know that according to their mandate, International Criminal Court limits its investigation only to several selected cases. But I do hope that they will take cases also of deliberate attack to energy infrastructure of Ukraine, which was recently named by International Commission on Inquiry, which was created by UN Human Rights Council as crimes against humanity. And I think that we have, every one of us have to work hard and to help International Criminal Court to see the broader picture. What do I mean? They named the illegal transferring of Ukrainian children to Russia as the war crimes. But this war has genocidal character. And this particular action is a part of this genocidal policy which Russian states imposed against Ukrainian nation. Because when Putin tells that Ukraine as a state has no right to exist, that there is no Ukrainian nation, we are all Russians, there is no Ukrainian language, there is no Ukrainian culture, and then Russian propagandists interpret it more clearly that Ukrainians has to be either re-educated as Russians or killed. And then we see the implication of this policy in reality. And this implication shows this genocidal intent, because when we speak about genocide, we have to prove this intent to destroy it partially or completely some group which is under defense of UN Convention Against Genocide. And you don't need to be a lawyer, just a common sense tell you that in order to destroy some group, let's say ethnic group, there is no necessity to kill all the members. You can forcibly change their identity and the whole ethnic group will be disappeared and returned to this crime, the legal deportation of Ukrainian children. They not just deported Ukrainian children, they put them in re-education camp or Russian family for forcible adoption, and they try to teach them that they are Russians. And parallel, we see how Russia provoked ethnic cleansing in the occupied territories with such tools like prohibiting Ukrainian language, prohibiting to teach Ukrainian history. Russia deliberately exterminates the local Ukrainian elite. And I read your brilliant article together with Natalia Gumenyuk according this crime, and they persecute active people of local communities, mayors, local deputies, priests, artists, journalists, volunteers. And all together, it's a complex picture of this genocidal policy, how to forcibly change identity and totally or partially liquidate the whole ethnic group.
Yes, I know you know this, but I don't know if the whole audience knows that the word genocide, the word which is a modern invention, was invented by a lawyer from Lviv, from Western Ukraine, Raphael Lemkin, who had a kind of Polish, Jewish, Ukrainian identity, and whose many of his original ideas about genocide, I think, came from the part of the world that he comes from. And his original definition of genocide included exactly the categories of behavior that you just described. So cultural attacks, religious attacks, changing language, changing identity, ethnic cleansing. I mean, I think one of the things that happened after the Second World War is that we developed a very narrow idea of what genocide was, based on the example of the Holocaust, which was, of course, a horrific example. And it was an example of an attempt to physically destroy, murder every single one of a given nation. And we stopped seeing the fact that genocide is, was the original definition was wider than that. And it included, as I said, all these other categories of behavior, changing, re-educating children, eliminating, as the Russians have done both now and so many times in the past, eliminating the kind of social leaders, the mayors, the city councilors, the policemen, the intellectuals, the museum directors, in a given place, in order to rob that community of its kind of intellectual life and its political life. And so one of the things that might be an outcome of this war is a re-examination of what the word means, and maybe a deeper understanding of what it is. And that will, I think, both help us understand what it is that Putin is doing in Ukraine, and maybe down the road, it'll help us understand this kind of behavior when we see it in other countries, in other times, in other places. And another kind of post-Second World War mistake that I think people made is people had decided that genocide was a crime that was very rare, and it happened only in the context of a world war, and it was a once in a century event. And actually we see several attempts at genocide since then, and some famous, some less so, and we see some happening now. So whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's the Chinese attempt to destroy the identity of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, we now recognize it as something that human beings do, especially when they have this kind of autocratic power. And so maybe the conversation that I know you and people like you have been leading will help people to understand what this is and why it's so damaging and dangerous. Don't know what you think about that.
I totally agree that we have to rethink a lot of law categories. And as a lawyer, I know that law is dynamic material. It's not something conservative and something which can't change. And we have to develop the law and legal mechanism to be effective in the new circumstances in which all of us are currently present. And I remember that before large-scale invasion started, I always try closely follow to the articles or some documents which is composed by Russians, political technologists. And I don't remember the name, maybe it was Surkov, maybe not, but the main idea of the doctrine of this person was that the main battle in current world is the battle for the right to give names to phenomena and processes. And I think that this is a battle for the truth. And Ukrainians in this battle have this sense of urgency, because for us, time resulted in numerous deaths in battlefield, in death and suffering of people in occupied territories, even in deep rears. But this is the task which has to be done jointly by the whole international community. There is a problem which can't be solved in some national borders or with some national standards.
Yes. I mean, there is now, as you said at the beginning of this conversation, there's now quite a lot of resistance to the idea that these kinds of ideas can be universal. And that's also, of course, the result of many years of Russian and Chinese and Iranian pushback against the international system. They argue there's no such thing as universal values. These are Western, or they're they're colonial, or there's something that the West, the Western world or the democratic world imposes on them. Convincing people that this, in a way, talking about Ukraine in a broader context, talking about it in the context of Xinjiang or in the context of other crimes happening in other places, I think doesn't take away from the uniqueness of what's happening in Ukraine, but it might even add to it. That this is a problem being faced in different ways by different people in different parts of the world, and it's just more extreme and more violent right now in Ukraine. But it's a human problem that we all need to think about. I mean, that might be a useful way to have people think about these things going forward. And the Ukrainians have done very well in making that argument and putting this argument back to the international community. This is happening to us, but it's not a local conflict. It's a conflict that has a deeper, wider meaning, and it has echoes in other places, and the results of it will be felt in other places. And I think quite a lot of people do understand that. Not everybody. I know that you were in Taiwan because we met there, and it's a very interesting to me to see the Taiwanese receive the Ukrainians with such interest. I mean, not two nations that have not had very much to do with each other historically. I mean, far away, and different cultures and different languages and so on. But of course, the Taiwanese immediately understood that what was happening in Ukraine could happen to them, and they understood why it was universal, and they were very clear about it. I mean, you must have had many reactions like that in other countries as well.
There are a lot of things which have no limitation in national borders. When I tell the story of Volodymyr Vakulenko and how his family to the last hope that he is alive, and just like thousands of other Ukrainian civilians was in Russian captivity, and then when his body was found in non-identified grave under the number 319, and how it was difficult for his family to accept the result of identification, this story of children writer and the pain of his family and his struggle for freedom and for his human dignity is understandable for each people who might speak about this case, regardless their citizenship, their nationality, ideology, political views, religion, color of skin, social position, etc., etc. Because first and foremost, we are all human beings. And that is why a lot of things are universal for all of us, like human solidarity. And I know that from my own experience that when you can't rely upon a legal instrument, you can still rely upon on people. And massive mobilization of people in different countries can change our world for better and do it much more quicker than the UN intervention.
No, I believe you're right. I mean, in a way, the evidence of that is the enormous amount of support that people showed for Ukraine in countries around the world. You know, I think it had an impact on politicians, at least in democracies, where politicians have to respond to public opinion. I think there was a pretty clear relationship between the outrage that people felt at the beginning of the invasion last year and the outrage they felt at the deliberate targeting of civilians and hospitals in those very first strikes, you know, in the Battle of Mariupol. And the outrage they felt when the news came about Bucha, and the outrage they continue to feel. And I think that outrage has had an enormous impact on geopolitics. I mean, it's why, it's part of why, anyway, you have American support for Ukraine's military defense, which, you know, would have been hard to imagine a few years earlier. You know, these are not, again, the United States and Ukraine are not countries with an ancient alliance going back many decades, or it's not like American Britain or American France. It's a newer relationship, but the force of public opinion, I think, made a really big difference in shaping outcomes in this war, and I think it will continue to do so.
Yes. It's very human approach, but it's also a very pragmatic approach from the long-term perspective, because we live in very interconnected world, and only spread of freedom make this world safer. And the result of this Russian war against Ukraine will have a huge impact to the whole world, because it can inspire authoritarian leaders to do the same. And that is why the civilized world needs success of Ukraine. Success of Ukraine will have a huge impact to democratic future of Russia itself, and to the possibility to expand democracy in our region.
I think in your region and around the world, I agree with that. Ola, I think your idea was that we would take questions after 40 minutes, and it's been 45 minutes. Maybe you can tell us.
You are the very first speaker who was happy to take minutes in time. Thank you for that. And thank you for this conversation and for pointing out all these nuances, especially on genocide and on a remit of international organization and competences as well. Also, some cultural and political insights, like those geographical parallels with the other world, and pointing out the weaker points of Western democracy as well. So we have plenty of questions on that, especially that was a very popular question in my direct messages. Do you both believe on Putin in Hague? Can you picture him arrested and going under the court?
So as I said, there are circumstances in which I can imagine it. I can imagine a future Russian government, which could be of any kind of government, not necessarily a democratic government, but one which began to see Putin as a problem, and would see the solution to the problem as giving him away to The Hague. So it sounds, you know, like science fiction right now, but I think we should be open to thinking about a lot of options, a lot of different kinds of things that could happen as a result of this war. Already, the Russian experience of loss, you know, I mean loss and military loss, has to be having some impact, if only inside the army. And if these losses continue and if they grow larger, then I can imagine them having some kind of political impact as well. We're not at that moment yet, but we might get there. And at that moment, then The Hague might seem like, you know, a nice, clean solution for somebody.
And it leads me to another question to you, Anne, about how do you see how people inside Russia, being so overwhelmed and overloaded with all that propaganda, can see any perspective of changes? And do you personally believe that it can appear at some point?
So again, you know, I have to have some faith in the possibility of change. I mean, in my lifetime, I have seen countries change. Actually, Ukraine is a country that changed a lot from when the first time I went there in 1990. Actually, I think the very first time might have been 1985. So, you know, there's been an enormous change in the political system, but also the atmosphere, the nature of people, their relationships with one another. You know, change is not something that's impossible. I mean, it's usually not fast, but it does happen. And I would say that there's one thing about Russia that encourages me, which is that the nature of Russian propaganda, I think you mentioned this a few minutes ago in your introduction, the nature of Russian propaganda is designed to make people apathetic. So what you don't see in Russia is you don't see like big masses of crowds of people, you know, chanting in favor of the war. And you don't see lots and lots of young men rushing to sign up to fight. Which you did have, for example, in Nazi Germany. You know, there have been other highly militarized societies where you had this enthusiasm for war and this enthusiasm for conflict. And I don't see that in Russia. I see, you know, the opposite. We see some people passively accepting conscription, but we also see, you know, thousands of people left the country. So, you know, so it's not a society that's, you know, that's very motivated to do anything. On the contrary, it's a society that's motivated to stay out of politics, keep away, and you know, try and not get in trouble and not stay in the conflict. And there, you know, that's a sign that some different kind of leader, again, not necessarily a democratic leader or not necessarily a pro-Western leader, but some democratic leader could make the decision to end the war. And would not then face massive, at least from the general public, you know, wouldn't necessarily face massive reaction, because the public is mostly apathetic or mostly accepting, but mostly not very involved. And that, I think, shows that there is some possibility. I would also say, I mean, you know, there are Russians who think differently. There are Russians whose minds have been changed by the war. And I think we should be glad that their minds were changed. I mean, the most famous is Alexei Navalny, who made a statement saying that he now recognizes the invasion of Crimea as a mistake. So let's accept that and hope that, you know, that's a reflection of other people rethinking past positions as well.
Keeping some hopes for bigger changes we can't predict yet. Thank you so much. I have more, but then switch to Oleksandra for a while. Oleksandra, do you really see Putin jailed?
Yes, and I even visualize it with the details. I openly said previously that I will dress my best dress on the day, and when I tweeted in the Twitter, my colleagues from different fields joined me, and they tell that they will be accompanying me on this day. So I think that we now fighting to make it possible, and it's not easy fight, but because future is not guaranteed. And now with our action, we define the future which we want to achieve. But we have to make such visualization just to get more energy from this picture.
I mean, you know, this question came from the person based in Hungary, and so we probably understand the background of those doubts, right, because of the political picture. But also here is another question from this area, that if you think that the UN is not really effective anymore, what would you propose to replace those tools? Because you mentioned a lot that here is a huge influence and impact of, ordinary people, but which are the real working tools we can use to fight?
If we speak about level of sense, we have to look deeply in the world, what is humanity is, and what is humanity is in 21st century. Because when I see how Russian troops deliberately shelling residential buildings, schools, churches, hospitals, attack evacuation corridors, manage filtration camp system, organize forcible deportations, and commit murders, tortures, rapes, abductions, and other kind of offenses against civilians, when I try to simplify this picture and to name this action, I say that it's barbaristic actions. So it's a very simplified model, but I have a feeling when you try to promote that each person has life and has rights and human dignity, this is essential, like development of current civilizations. And now we are fighting against barbarians who say, no, it's not like this. People have no human dignity, and that is why people can be killed, tortured, and raped. And this is the symbolical level. But in practical level, we have to build and to redesign a new world infrastructure which can protect and amplify and secure this meaning of humanity. Because when we speak about human rights, it's not so-called Western values. It's very common, widespread ideas which you can find in each religions, in each culture, that life of each person matters, that each person have human dignity. So this is a question how to develop in 21st century a new world architecture to make these words become a real policy.
I think that's going to be just something in between what you just said, that each life and each personality, each human life matters, and a very pragmatic approach, right? The way Zelensky responded in your recent interview a few days ago, and right, why would Americans keep helping Ukraine? And here is another question to you as a historian, as knowing this deep background of Ukrainian history, of the never-ending fights, always looking for identity because of the external conditions. How would you project the development of Ukraine as a state in this after war, in this new world? Definitely not historical question, but just yeah.
You're asking to predict the future, which is always very risky. But look, I mean, you know, the amazing story of Ukraine is the story of a nation coming to understand and define who it is and what it is. And that process is accelerated in the last year. I was just in Ukraine, and one of the things I did was I met a lot of really creative people who are on the front line, but in different ways. So not only as soldiers, but as computer technologists and IT experts, and designing new ways of using software to fight the war, new ways of robotics and so on. And one of the things that impressed me about this group of people was how connected they are to other parts of the world. I mean, they're kind of, they're sitting in, as I said, somewhere in Eastern Ukraine, and yet they're connected to Silicon Valley, and yet they're connected to Brussels, and yet they're talking to people in the United States. Ukrainians have come to understand their national identity as being an open country. In other words, what it means to be Ukrainian doesn't mean you're an ethnic Ukrainian, whatever that actually even is. It doesn't even mean, your native language is Ukrainian, because many Ukrainians, their native language is Russian or another language. It doesn't mean you have to belong to any particular religion. You can have a lot of different kinds of backgrounds and identities and still be Ukrainian as long as you feel yourself to be part of this open, integrated culture, as long as you are a Democrat, as long as you believe in this set of liberal values, as long as you believe in Ukrainian sovereignty, and as long as you want to win the war. And that the evolution of Ukrainianness in that direction, I think bodes really well for the future, because that's a very broad kind of definition of nationality. You know, it's a kind of civic patriotism rather than a narrow ethnic patriotism. And it gives Ukraine something really broad and interesting to build on after the war is over, you know, because a wide definition, an inclusive idea of what your country is, a belief in liberal values in an open society, will make you a great place to do business, to live, and to work. And people, I think, in a weird way, people recognize it even now. People are, of course, many people are afraid to come to Ukraine, but those who do are so impressed by what they find there and by the culture of volunteering and the culture of civic participation that I think all of those things are going to be real magnets drawing people and investment and ideas to Ukraine after the war.
And I would just add here that, it's not such a new thing about this open identity, because I'm personally from Western Ukraine. And in my childhood, we would speak, Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, all mixed up. I recognized that I couldn't really understand when I switched those languages automatically. We had a joke that if your mom is Polish and your dad is German, so you are the real Ukrainian. So this is a real...
Of course, it's not entirely new, but it's now somehow more explicit, and it's the...
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I think it became clear even to ourselves, for sure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for answering these questions. We have way more, especially about the economical approach and how you think, where if Ukraine go in this supply side economic policies, if it's really very dangerous and all of that. If you want to comment the last thing about what would you think is most important focus on helping Ukraine right now, that would be great.
The most important thing on helping Ukraine right now is making sure that Ukrainians win the war. So, and that means, it means taking back all of territory. It means thinking about a security architecture for the post-war period so that Ukrainians can be safe. As one Ukrainian friend of mine says, the war will be over when I can get in a plane in Kiev and fly to Paris, once again. And so reestablishing systems of safety and protection. And then, of course, when we have some kind of justice, which can take a lot of different forms. And I'd love to hear Oleksandra talk about that too. It's another time we'll do it again. But what will be there has to be some way in which people feel that the Russians don't have impunity for what happened, that there is a price that was paid for the things that were done to innocent people.
Yeah, I think that's a central point for most of Ukrainians right now. Oleksandra?
I totally agree with Anne. Ukraine has to win, and Ukraine has to win fast. And we need assistance of international community to achieve this goal. But victory for Ukraine is not just repeal Russian troops from our territory and the occupied Crimea and other part of Ukrainian regions, which are currently under Russian occupation. Victory for Ukraine is to succeed in democratic transition of our country. Because Putin started this war not in February 2022. He started this war in February 2014, when Ukraine obtained a chance for the quick democratic transformation after collapse authoritarian regime due to revolution of dignity. And in order to stop us on this way, he unleashed the war of aggression, occupied Crimea, part of Lugansk and Donetsk region, and last year he extended this war to the large-scale invasion. So we have to win value dimension of this war. We have to demonstrate the success of democratic transition. And this is a very ambitious goal.
Thank you for that. And if you ask yourself, what can I do as an intellectual today? So I would say, follow Aleksandra's speech quote, ordinary people have much greater impact than they can even imagine. And massive mobilization of ordinary people around the world can change the world's history much more quickly than any UN intervention. And then afterwards, find your best dress and join Aleksandra's party. And this is what our dialogues are about, genuine perspective on the reality and your own responsibility about that. This all would not be possible without the support of our partners, the US Embassy in Ukraine, Pan America, the Ukrainian Institute, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, Local History, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and the Harman Institute at Columbia University. The gratitude, of course, to Pan Ukraine, which continues to stand at the front lines in the name of freedom and truth. All are based in Ukraine. As Pan International, we are proud to be a platform that supports freedom of expression. Thank you again, our great speakers. That was pure pleasure and great privilege. I felt that those 45 minutes are definitely not enough and really hope to hear more from you in the close future. And the next episode will be held next Thursday, 30th of March at 6 p.m. Kyiv time, 4 p.m. London time. We'll be hosting Timothy Hardonesh, British journalist and author, researcher, and Oleksandra Matviichuk, the director of Ukrainian Institute London, and also the author. Follow our dialogues and stand with Ukraine. This is our shared responsibility today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.